Nimbus 550 build video. At the end of the last episode, we'd taken care of the main rotor head and our swash plate. In this episode, we're just going to finish up the linkages and then move forwards into assembling the main body of the helicopter, or the frame of the helicopter, as we would call it. In an airplane, you might call it the fuselage. So, what I've done is gone ahead and sort of laid out a bunch of these sub-assemblies we're going to use when we get into the frame. I've gotten some of my linkages built, but I left some to show you how to do it. And for every single component you see here, this is one of the boom clamps. I've removed every single one of these screws. This is how they arrive when you unbag them, but I removed all of the screws, I've cleaned them, and then replaced them. I like to sort of store them in the component part, because I find if I keep them in here, number one, I don't lose them or lose track of them. I know which size screw goes in which hole right away, and I can kind of lay it out when I'm ready to actually screw it in. It just sort of keeps things organized, which I like. So everything here has been cleaned. So do take the time to clean every last little bolt. This is, I don't know if you can tell, but how dirty a lot of those screws are. So you definitely do not want to skip that step. All that oil that was on that paper towel is going to stop your thread lockers from working. So do be sure and do that. All right, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into our linkages. If we take a quick look at the manual here, you can see that our main rotor linkage, these are the two main drive links that will go between our swash plate and our blade grip arms here. The gap between the ball links, which are the plastic parts on the end, should be 15.5 millimeters. So remember, 15.5 millimeters. All right, so this is a digital caliper, and it's used for precisely measuring distances. It comes in really handy, and everybody should have one on their workbench. Usually you can set it between metric and imperial. You generally want it on metric for helicopters. All of our screws and bolts follow that, as well as most of the dimensions in the manual. So you simply squeeze it all the way together, zero it out if it's not zeroed already, and we're going to set this for 15.5 millimeters, which is not too hard to get dead on perfect. Oh, just had it. And then many of these calipers will have the ability to tighten it down and lock it down once you hit that specific measurement. There we go, 15.5 millimeters. Okay, so I'm going to show you one of these that I already built, and you can see, so the caliper will have usually two sides, so this is kind of the inside and outside measurement here. So you can see here that fits precisely between the ball links, 15.5 millimeters. All right, so that's one of them. Now, it's extremely important that when we build these, we get them exactly the same length. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is when we get into things further down the road when we get into setup. So, for now, we're going to take our ball links here and screw them on to our turnbuckle. This metal part here is called the turnbuckle. Now, the interesting thing, in the manual they show you that there is a little slotted line, it's very hard to see, sort of on the turnbuckle. You can see it kind of here. And that means that the side next to that is a reverse thread, meaning instead of turning things clockwise to tighten them, you would actually run them counterclockwise to tighten them. So I'm going to get this one started, and you can see as I turn it counterclockwise, it goes. Now, you can do these by hand, just like this, with a pair of pliers, and then turn them this way. If you have one of these, this is actually out of an SAB kit. There are some folks that 3D print these as well that you can purchase. I think Keith Williams at KC3D has some of these you can order, and it just saves your fingertips. It just kind of sits around the ball link, and I'm using the other one as a rough reference of how much thread to leave exposed. Right, so there's half of it on. I'm going to go ahead and grip it the other way. Now this other side here goes the opposite direction. And we do this because we want to be able to adjust this turnbuckle, this metal part in between, once these two ends are connected to various parts of the helicopter, and have it either get longer or shorter. So if the threads are opposite, the turnbuckle does its purpose. All right, so I've got roughly about the same amount of threads showing as our other arm, or link I should say. I'm just going to check it in the caliper now. It looks like I need to tighten a little bit more. So when you do that, you sort of take a look, see which end could kind of use to tighten more than the other. Try and keep them kind of equal amounts of thread showing. And the other thing to keep in mind, this is a little tricky, but if you look at the ball links, you can see that one side of it kind of has an extra circle around it. And that is the end that will clamp onto the ball. The other side has a slightly smaller circle on it the other way. Okay, so now you can see we've tightened these to the point where we have the precise gap between the ball links that we're supposed to have. The other thing we want is there's a little number written, and the numbers change probably by batch, who knows, that's on the outside here. You want to make sure those numbers are on the same side. That number denotes the side that's on the outside. Once we clamp this onto a ball, the number would be opposite the ball. So the number would be here, the ball would be here. And we'll talk about that a little later when we get to the point of connecting them. All right, so we've gotten these two main drive links built with a gap of 15.5 millimeters. Let's take a quick look at the manual for the other links. Okay, so the version of the kit that we're building here is the mini servo version of the kit. And if we scroll down to the bottom of page 10, you can see that this kit is available with two different servo configurations. There's a mini servo version, which is what we have here, and then a full-size servo version. So for the mini servo version, 23.4 millimeters is what we want to set our digital caliper for, and it's what this gap here will be. Now, the difference between the mini servo version and the full-size servo version can be a few things. Eventually, XL Power plans to release a stretch kit for this helicopter. Take it from, a 550 to 580 millimeter blade length to, 600 and possibly a little longer. No official details have been released yet. If you're going to have a 600 size helicopter, if you're going to run it on 12S, and you're going to really smack the heck out of it, some guys just prefer full-size servos. They want that response and power and torque and whatnot. If you're going to keep it as a 6S helicopter, there's no reason to go beyond the mini servos, in my personal opinion anyway. So if you're going for 12S setups and you're a harder 3D guy, then definitely, number one, you probably aren't watching this video, and number two, you should go with full-size servos. But anyway, the rest of us coming into the hobby, starting out with perhaps our first kit build, the mini servo version is perfect. So 23.4 millimeters is what we want to set our caliper to next. I'll zero my caliper again, 23.4. These are for our servo linkages. They'll go between the ball and the end of the servo arm and the swash plate. It's extremely important that all three of these be exactly the same length. So these I know are precisely at 23.4 millimeters in the gap here. You can see that right here. If I show you the overhead, that'll help. So there's 23.4, and we're going to do the same thing with this last one here. So same process here, nothing fancy. The only difference is that on the servo linkages, there's no turnbuckle adjustment. So both threads are the same direction here. So it's just a matter of getting them started. You can kind of look at one you've already done for an idea of how many threads you should leave exposed. And I'm using the Lynx balling pliers, which we're going to use a lot later on, but they've got a little channel in them that you can kind of lock down on the link, the metal part of it here. It works really well. There are some guys that like to run chapstick on the threads to make this easier. There's a bunch of tricks. I don't know. I don't really find it all that difficult. And it's really worth taking plenty of time here to make sure that these are perfect. Any discrepancy in length between these will directly affect the performance of the helicopter. So if you pirouette, it's going to drift off to one side, and just all of the handling characteristics. Right. So we've got our servo links built. We're just going to take these and set them off to the side, and our main drive links are built. Again, in the manual they show connecting these, and there's certainly nothing wrong if you want to follow it step by step. But again, I like to level my swash plate without the main rotor head in the way. So I'm going to go ahead and leave all this off, and we'll put it on much later in the build. So I'm going to tuck my caliper out of the way. By the way, owning one of these is great. Sometimes in some helicopters, the screws just come in bags and they're loose, and telling the difference between a 6mm, an 8mm, a 12mm, and a 10mm when they're all in the same step, especially when you're assembling the frame, can be a pain. But having one of these calipers to whip out and just measure the threads and confirm that you're about to put the correct screw or bolt, or you have the right piece of the helicopter handy, is great. So definitely a digital caliper is a must. All right, now we're going to move on to the frame. Essentially what we're going to do here is get our battery release tray mechanism ready to go, and then you can see how it all fits together with the battery rail here. So really these steps should kind of be on the same page here. We're going to make sure that the small notch in the rail faces up. That's what allows this latch pin to fit through. We kind of really should put all these together at once. And then we're going to put this battery rail in on one frame side, and then we'll do the same thing except without the battery release catch on the other side. Okay, so let's just spend a quick moment to talk about this battery release. One of the things that, yes, there's a picture of a tube of Loctite and an arrow, but that is not clear is that you can actually unscrew this battery piece here from the metal base plate. So here's the metal base plate in this hand, here's the battery piece. These screw together. Now it is extremely important, when you order this it all comes as one part, so put some red Loctite, or at the very least blue, on these threads. If you don't, this battery spring-loaded release will unscrew itself during flight, leaving your flight battery ready to slide out the helicopter, especially if you don't have a canopy on, and this piece will go through your blades. It's happened on the XL Power V1 and the V2, and now it's going to happen on the 550. So they really need to call out that you absolutely must disassemble this piece and put Loctite on these threads. So do not forget that. All right, with the lecture out of the way, let's go ahead and dig into our piece. So we're going to grab our frame sides here. Now, when you have two of these and they look exactly the same, you want to spend a minute and give them a quick look over and make sure that there isn't a specific left side and a specific right side. Usually the way you tell the specific is there's a like a chamfer, and here's one for the bolts, but they actually did it on both frame sides. So the frame sides are identical, which is handy when you order some. So we just need to decide which is going to be the left and which is going to be the right, and that'll quickly be decided when we put this battery release catch in. So tuck one of these off to the side, and let's go ahead and get started here. All right, so now we've got our frame side here, and we've got our battery rail here. And you can see here, there's that little notch they're talking about in the manual. So it's right at the top of the rail, and it is such that the pin from the battery tray retainer can slide just over the top of this. Okay, so you'll see in the frame here, there's a couple of chamfers. You need to make sure that this is the inside of the frame, because the screws that will hold our battery clip in, which we're about to put in right now, will need to go through that. So it's these two little screws here. They come installed. So I've already removed these and cleaned them. I'm going to get a little bit of blue Loctite for these guys. Here's some blue that we'll use for those, and we're going to put red Loctite on the threads of the actual spring clip itself. So there's some red for that. So let's take care of this part first. So the way I like to apply just a little bit of red or any kind of Loctite into threads when I don't want it to get everywhere is I use what's called an awl. It's essentially a metal pokey stick. You can buy them in like 4-packs on Amazon for $8 or something silly. So just putting a little red Loctite, getting it in the threads here, dragging it around with the awl. You just wipe that off on a paper towel. And then we'll just take this piece here and just thread it right on in. And I use the awl because I don't want that Loctite getting inside this mechanism and gumming it up, so I want to very carefully control where it goes. Alright, so next we're going to grab these two little guys here. A little bit of blue Loctite on these guys. And the technique I always use is put it directly on the bolt, take as much of it as I can, push it into threads with my finger, wipe my finger off, and then we'll come in here And this will screw into our metal frame. And then the technique, whenever you have more than one screw going into something, is always to just loosely put the first screw in, get all of the screws in first, loose, don't tighten them. And then, once you have all the screws in, so you know everything is in alignment, you can go ahead and send it home. So now that I know this is good, I'm going to kind of lightly tighten. Okay. And then just a note on how much you should tighten these things. Don't over tighten these bits at all. It doesn't take a lot of force. You really want to just snug them up, maybe give just a little bit extra force at that point, not a lot, not, you know, a death turn grip kind of thing, and just make sure it's in there pretty well. All right, so this next battery rail. So the battery rail also has a correct side to it. There is a chamfer in it, such that the bolt heads will sit flush with this. So again, we need to keep that notch in mind, and we need the chamfer to go towards the inside of the frame, which is like so, because these little tiny bolts here are going to go through the battery rail, through the frame, and into these little teeny tiny lock nuts. Now, what is a lock nut? A lock nut is a small nut that has a plastic ring inside it, in here, that grabs the threads of the bolts that go through it and hold it. It provides a ton of friction. That plastic ring means we can't use Loctite. Loctite, or thread lockers in general, will eat away at the plastic, and they'll make it very brittle, and the thread locker can't do its job anymore. The plastic breaks, and then the bolt just pulls out. So anytime you see one of these lock nuts with a nylon insert in here, you don't use thread locker. So this is one of those cases. So all of these bolts here on this frame rail will not use Loctite. So like I said, start to get it aligned with that little notch, and then get your bolt through. I'm actually going to start with the first bolt on one end, just to help kind of get the thing in alignment. Push it through here, and then see if I can get it started with just my fingers. I can. So yeah, go ahead, get it started with your fingers, and then come back with a pair of pliers, hold the nut in place, and tighten. Again, don't go crazy over tightening the bolt. So now we've got this kind of as a hinge. We can line up the last one, put that one in, and get going. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get a screw in every single one of these holes, and then get a nut on the back side, get these all tightened, and then we'll come back and talk about the other side. Okay, so we've got our first half of the frame done. We've got our battery retaining clip on the outside of the frame, and then we've made sure that it's fitting through the frame easily. It's sliding through here, not any trouble. And then we've got our bolts running through from the inside of the frame with our nuts on the outside. These are all nice and tightened down. Again, no thread lock here, not on lock nuts. Now we need to build the opposite to this. So this will go just like this. However, the frame rail will go on the inside so that they're both sort of facing each other. The other side does not have the battery retaining clip, however, but follows the same procedure. So I'm going to go ahead and take care of that and go from there. It wasn't as bad as I thought. Essentially, you get the bolt pushed through, start the nut by hand on the other end, and then grab a pair of pliers, hold the nut, grab a driver, tighten the screw. Not so bad. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get the other side done, and we'll go on from there. Okay, so we now have both of the lower side frames with the battery rails installed. So you can see they now make a set where when you face them into each other, they look the same and the rails are on the inside. For now, we're going to just tuck these aside for a minute. And we're going to take care of now, if we look at the manual here, a couple of sub-assemblies here to get ready for the next step. So here we've just got our carbon fiber plate and a couple of frame spacers that we're going to go ahead and get installed, and then we're going to work on our idler pulleys over here for the tail belt. So let's go ahead, get our carbon plate. Now you'll note here that there are some chamfers here. So make sure that our bolts go through the chamfer into the metal frame spacer. So the side with the chamfers is the top. Here's our two metal spacers here, and I left the screws in them when I was working on them. I cleaned them, put them back. Now I know which way up they go without having to think too hard. Screws out, and we'll go on top of the rail like that. Just take our screw, get a little blue Loctite on it, and we're going to go through the chamfered side into the top here of our frame spacer. Again, we'll just sort of set that loose, get Loctite on our other screw, push it into the threads. And I push it into the thread because I don't want a ton of extra Loctite. It just makes a mess, and you don't need it. And now that I have 2 screws in, I'll go ahead and tighten these all the way down. Again, snug it up, give it a tiny bit extra, and that's really it. All you need to do. It's always a good idea to follow with a paper towel, take care of any extra Loctite that's sort of dribbled out. Just keeps things looking neat, and neatness counts on a helicopter. And then same thing with the other 2 bolts. Okay, this sub-assembly is now done. It's time to get our idler pulleys and those components out. Alright, so the next sub-assembly is our idler pulleys. So let's take just another quick look at the manual here again. And you can see that we need some, again, they use blue Loctite in all these instances, but anytime you're trying to hold a bearing in place, you want to use green Loctite or retaining compound. So we need to use some retaining compound to seat these bearings inside the pulleys. And then this is really just going to be press fit assembled. Once it's bolted between the frames, it will stay captive and can't come out. So, taking a look here, when you get the idler pulleys, the bearings will be temporarily just seated inside them. But what I did is I just took a small 1.5 millimeter driver and very gently just pushed on the bearings, and they popped right out. So don't use too much force. You don't want to break the bearing. And then here's how I like to get my bearings captured without gumming up the works, right? So if you get green retaining compound inside the inner workings of the bearing, it's bad, right? It's going to gum it up. So really you only want green Loctite where you absolutely need it, and you need a minuscule amount. So I take the tip of my awl and I kind of whisk it around in there, and I only want a tiny bit, and I'm just going to use this to now spread it around the inside here, and I'm going to do this on both sides. So it's amazing how tiny an amount you can spread, and then you can sort of look around and you'll see all the moisture in there. So it really takes just that little and spread it all around. This ensures we get a nice thin coating all the way around. I take a little paper towel and I'm just going to dab just in case any extra came off, and then it's literally just a press fit. So you take the bearing and just press fit it into that hole. And then that retaining compound, we'll make sure, see there it is, just press fit in there. It doesn't come out. It's a pretty decent friction fit in here as well. You almost could probably get away without doing the retaining compound, but it just helps reduce wear on these things. Just going to do the same thing for the other one. Okay, and then boom, pulley, pulley. All press fit together. Now again, the reason we use retaining compound on a bearing is, in this case, right, we've got a pulley that'll be rotating very quickly and a bearing. And the best way for the bearing to do its job is if it's attached now through the retaining compound to this pulley, so that the outer race of the bearing, the outside, perimeter metal part of it, spins when the pulley spins, and the inside can spin, opposite around this shaft. What happens is sometimes, the pulley could theoretically spin and the bearing could not spin, and then it just creates, essentially the short version is it creates a lot of extra wear on the bearing when they're not rotating together as they should be. So that's why we use the retaining compound. All right, so now this next part is pretty simple. We take these 2 sort of metal shafts, and they just press fit into this piece, and then you've got these 4 little metal spacers here. So we just pop one of those onto the shaft first, slide it to the bottom, same thing on the other side, and then we pop our bearings on. There's no up or down to the bearings. And then pop another spacer on. And then you take the other side of here and it just press fits onto here. So now you have to grip this way, because until this is bolted into the frames of the helicopter, it's just a press fit, and if you even set it down the wrong way, it'll fall apart. If you happen to have a rubber band in your shop, it's a great way. I usually will find one and wrap it all the way around. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Okay, so we've got our idler pulleys built, and I just found a little Velcro strap and wrapped it around here just to hold this piece together. We're going to tuck it aside for just a moment. We're going to need it here in just a minute. Let's take a look at this next step where we're going to assemble one of our upper side frames and lower side frames together and start the first half of our frame assembly here. So you can see here that we're going to incorporate this first little sub-assembly we did with the two frame spacers on it in here. That is going to bolt through, so a bolt is basically going to go through the lower side frame, then through the upper side frame, then into the metal rail. Same thing over here, and then we're going to do the same thing down here, only we're going to bolt into our boom clamps over here and our idlers here. Now the way I like to do these steps, there's a lot of bolts and screws going on here. So you can see here that the M 2.5 by 6 is yellow in the picture and the 2.5 by 8 is red in the picture. So that's how you tell which bolts go where. I believe all of these will be getting Loctite. They're all going metal to metal. The important thing that's not called out in the manual is the boom clamp at the back has the pinch bolt in it. And I'm going to show you this on camera in just a second, but just remember that, and I'll explain why that matters in just a minute. So let's come over to the bench here and let's start grabbing the components we need. So we need our right side frame. So this is the one without the battery clip in it. Okay, so grab one of the upper side frames. They're both identical. It doesn't matter which is which, and bring it over. We've got our right-hand side lower frame here. We've got one of our upper frames here. And then you can see from when we looked at the manual there that these boom clamps are going to go in such that the bolt on the top tightening part is going to point towards the left side frame. And then it's very important, of the two of these, the differences between these two boom clamps is one of them has a pinch bolt in it, and the pinch bolt is this little guy right here, this extra bolt right here. And what that does is once we actually have our tail boom inserted through here and everything's perfect and we've tensioned the belt and everything's ready to go, well, one of the last things we'll do is tighten the screw so much that it actually pierces through the side of the boom. It helps hold it so it doesn't slip, but most importantly what it does is it grounds the boom to the rest of the helicopter and ensures there's a solid metal connection between the aluminum and the boom and the rest of the helicopter. It just helps reduce electrical interference essentially with the receiver. So make sure that this boom clamp with the pinch bolt goes towards the back. We do that because the access hole to tighten this bolt is only available through the back of the frame. It's this hole right here in the subframe. We'll actually let you stick a driver right through it to get to that bolt. So that's important to do. So know that. So pay attention to the direction these boom clamps go and make sure the one with the pinch bolt is the one at the back. So I kind of like to sort of get everything all laid out here on my bench as best as possible. I'll line the screws up for these steps because they get a little confusing when you've got all this stuff going on, right? It's a lot to keep track of. So I pull, like I said, I keep my bolts in their locations until I need them. So I'm going to pull them out here. And I like to do these steps kind of one bolt at a time with no Loctite. So that's right. Eventually all these bolts are going to get Loctite. But for now, I don't use any. And I do that because sometimes when you're tightening all these components together, you need things to be a little bit loose and kind of shift around. And you don't really want to tighten everything until you really have the whole frame assembly built and you've checked that the main shaft is moving freely, all these things that we're going to talk about in a minute. But for now, just trust me, no Loctite, and we're going to keep things loose. So we know that these two frames are going to overlap and that a bolt is going to go in the hole that is closest, that is the second hole here. So in the nose, second hole. So we're going to push that bolt through, then through the other hole, and then that's going to go into this frame spacer, this metal spacer that we did before. So go ahead and get that aligned. It's a little tricky, and get that tightened down. Again, not going super tight here, just a little bit. Just enough so I get a little bit of friction so it starts holding this thing together, but a little loose. Okay, great. Now, same thing. I know that the other bolt, it'll be obvious which hole this goes through. It's going to go through here and through here. and then into that metal spacer. And now that we've got these two bolts down, we can kind of relax a little bit because this thing is starting to hold itself together as a sub-assembly. So we've done second bolt hole here, and then it's obvious where this last one goes in, so we do that first. So again, we're doing kind of one component at a time so that we can slowly see what's going on. So we've got those two screws. We're going to move to the back, and I've got the manual open, just off to here. I got a laptop right here. So, I'm very carefully triple checking my work. Go slow. You're in no rush here at this point, right? So the next thing I'm going to do is install our idler pulley, and I've taken half of the bolts out of one side of this. You'll notice that one of the bolts was longer than the other, and that bolt is going to go on the bottom of the idler here. So I'm going to get the first shorter bolt started on this top piece. And the reason the bottom bolt is longer is it's just got to go through both the upper and the lower side frame. So I'm just finger starting these and loosely, again, just kind of snugging them up and then actually backing off our entrance. All right, so the longer bolt here will go in this bottom hole. And I will say, in the manual, those sort of long tracing lines of where the bolts are, it's kind of a little hard to figure out where things actually go through. But your idler pulley will go here. You can see it's essentially follow the gap in the top frame, look for the little indent in it, and that's where your idler pulley will go. So there's your two bolts there. And then the next two bolts we're going to put in are for our very next boom clamp. So again, we're going to take the boom clamp that does not have the pinch bolt in it. We're going to make sure that the top bolt here, this guy here, the head of the bolt faces away from the frame side we're working on. So we're going to go ahead and unscrew these two bolts here. And same deal here. We've got a shorter bolt on top and a longer bolt underneath. And then we're going to get this guy into these two holes here. And you'll see sort of this big wide hole right here, and then this hole right underneath is your top of the boom clamp. So just push that bolt through and get that guy started. Now there are probably some of you who are like, you could go ahead and put Loctite on this, the way this helicopter works. And that may be true, but I just like to take my time with these things, and I like to check alignment, and I want to make sure that everything is going to be all right, especially when we're putting the frame together. All right, so that's our first boom clamp now installed here. Again, it's the hole just under this gap, and then over here, same thing, where this hole is right here, these two holes underneath will be here. And although the pinch bolt is on the other side, this hole right here is how you're going to access that pinch bolt. So same thing here, shorter bolt on top, longer bolt on bottom. And again, do not forget that we didn't put Loctite on these bolts. We're going to have to go back and do that later once we have the whole frame assembled and it's all aligned and everything's happy. The other thing you can do is put Loctite on the bolts but not tighten them all the way and then go back and tighten them all the way. The Loctite will certainly still work that way, especially as it's only going to be a few hours old. We'll get this assembled to the point we put Loctite on this tonight, but this is just the way I like to do it. Okay, so now one of the things I like to do at this point, especially this step isn't so complicated, but some of these helicopter builds have a ton of bolts through here when you do these crazy steps where you start putting the frames together. I like to count the bolts here, and then I count the bolts in the manual on that step, and there were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 bolts used in the manual. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we're good. All right. So there we go. That is our first half loosely fit together. I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the next page of the manual and see what fun is in store for us here. Looks like we get to do the same thing on the other side. Same number of bolts and location. So really straightforward. Again, I still have all of my bolts in position from when I first opened the bags, clean the bolts and put them back. So I'm going to kind of lay these out in the same sort of orientation that the frame goes together, and that's how I remember where they go. And I'll keep the ones in pairs where I know that, like on the idler pulleys where there's a tall one and a short one. Now, because it's going to be a pain in the butt, whatever you did to hold this idler pulley together temporarily, in my case it was a little Velcro strap, you can go ahead and remove that. That'll be stable enough now that you can do it. And let's bring our two frame sides over from before here. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to start with this front bolt to kind of help hold these things together. And we got our same thing here. We take our front bolt, the second bolt hole, line it up with the second bolt hole in the upper frame, and then we can drive this through into this hole here. Now, the nice thing about using one of the front holes when you do these frame assemblies is you kind of get a hinge, and it helps just sort of hold things together while you get it all worked out. And then we're going to do the second bolt into that other frame spacer, kind of sight through the frame, try and get everything aligned, see if we can get it to just drop in. There we go, again leaving that just snugged up there. And then we'll do our long and short into the idler pulley. We're starting with the short one on top, and then our longer bolt into the bottom idler pulley rail there. And then the same rodeo with the boom clamps. Short one in first, on top, long one on bottom, and then lastly the final boom clamp, short one on top, long one on bottom. And then now that we have that done, let's take a minute to just check a few things. Number one, the positioning of these screws on the boom clamps. They should both be facing the same way. Should both be accessible via these access holes here. They should both be towards the top of the helicopter frame. And then just make sure that your boom clamp with the pinch bolt is in the back, because you can see how I access it just like that. There's no hole there here, so if you put it up front, you need to swap those. And then with that, we're ready to move on to the next step. Okay, so the next step has us putting the skids or the landing gear onto the helicopter. And I don't want to do that until I Loctite and tighten the screws. So now that I know the frame fits together, everything's looking nice and square initially, I'm going to go ahead and Loctite and tighten these. That doesn't mean when I start adding the main shaft, although in some helicopters, when the main shaft drops all the way through, you know, an upper bearing block and a lower that are really sort of integral to the frame, you really want to keep everything loose until you drag that main shaft and let it go through all the upper and lower, however many bearing blocks there are, and make sure it works. And certainly if you're on the full-size servo version with the extra lower bearing block, that'll be true. But for this version, the way that the plate with the servo and the bearing holders are there for the main shaft, really the frame, you know, we can go ahead and Loctite this and tighten it down. Now we're going to make sure it's just sitting square on my level table, and then I'm going to go ahead and pull every single one of these bolts back out one at a time, put Loctite in, and put it back in. I like to do this one at a time because now I know that the frame's assembled. I'm not trying to like move something to get it in. Again, could be overkill, but it's how I like to do things. So I'm going to go ahead and get all these Loctited, and then we'll come on back. Okay, so the next step is always one of my favorites, and that's getting to put these skids onto the helicopter. It starts to all of a sudden look like something once you get enough of the frame together and get it up on skids. So with that, let's go over to the manual for a second. Fairly straightforward here. So there are two metal spacer blocks. They call it the landing gear mount. And the important thing to notice is that the holes into the side of them are closer to the top of the block. So make sure that when you look at the side, that the holes here, the threaded inserts, are closer to the top of the block. And then we're going to go ahead and get those installed, and then down here we'll go ahead and bolt our skids to those. So here's how I always put my skids in. I basically do it all loose, so I'll go ahead and Loctite everything, but I leave it all very loose, and then I wait until I have the skid pipes completely installed. and the whole thing's sitting on a flat and level surface before I start to tighten anything. And it just tends to sit more level, that way it doesn't wobble or whatnot. If you put all the bolts back in after you clean them, then you can see here, let's try this the right way, sorry, that you actually end up with the bolts pointing straight down and the holes towards the top of the block. So it's just another way to help you figure out which way they go. So I'm going to go ahead and get a little bit of Loctite on a screw here. We'll get started with our first block. Again, I'm just going to very loosely, so it can still pivot and swing around, put these screws in to these. I will go ahead and get both of these blocks installed here, and you can see that they go into the two little bolt holes at the bottom here, and then your block just goes with the two bolts that will eventually go through the skids pointing down. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get this and the other one installed, and we'll come back from there. Okay, so now we've got our blocks installed just loosely. They've got a little bit of play in them so they can wiggle around. I'm going to go ahead and pop these bolts out here on top, and we'll get our skids ready to be installed. The landing skids here are both the same. There's not a front and a back. They're identical. There is a rake, and that refers to this angle here. So they slope, when you look at them from the side, they slope forwards, and they should slope forwards here towards the nose of the helicopter. In this case, if you can't tell yet from the frame, this is the front of the helicopter. This will be where the tail servo goes in the back. So they will be at a rake, such like this. There we go. When I'm looking at it in reverse on camera, it looks a little different. So we're going to go ahead and bolt these in with a forward slanting rake towards the nose of the helicopter. So we'll flip this on its back. Pretty straightforward here. Make sure you get some Loctite on these bolts. And again, I'm not going to tighten these all the way either, because I want the skid pipes in these skids so that they're perfectly aligned. I don't want to have to like force those through. And I want everything to be sitting nice and flat. See, that's still plenty loose. Wiggles around a decent amount here. Alright, same thing on the back. Okay, so front and rear skids, plenty of movement. And then now we're going to go ahead, flip this up, and grab our skid pipes, which is what these guys are called. This little upswing will go towards the front of the helicopter and slide them into our skids. Same thing on the other side. Go ahead and slide these in here. This one's a little stiffer for some reason. There we go. It's probably just an alignment thing, but once you get them in, so yeah, you can see everything is starting to sort of sit nice and flat and flush here. Kind of let it all work itself out. And now that I have the skid pipes in, I'm going to go ahead, before I tighten these little threaded set screws, I'm going to go ahead and tighten all of the bolts around. So that's the bolts here on the side, and then also underneath. I just really wanted to get these skid pipes in and have everything be sitting nice and flat. So we'll go ahead and get all those tightened now. Okay, so now we got all these tight. It's time for my least favorite step of any helicopter build. Inside a baggie are 4 of the tiniest little set screws you ever did see. I hate these things. They're easy to lose. They're easy to lose on the bench. They're easy to lose. If they go on the carpet, forget about it. You never find them again. They're fussy to get started in the skids, and they're just kind of an all-around pain. So it's never been my favorite. But let's go ahead and get these in. Now, a few important things here. Number 1, we need to set the distance of how far the skids are front to back, and this is completely personal preference. Some guys like to justify them a little more hanging out the back, and they do that such that even when there's no battery in the helicopter, it doesn't tend to tip backwards, because this extra skid will help. I like to sort of just center them, and then the next thing to decide is when your skids are facing you, how much angle is there, if any, to the front of the skid. I like to angle them in about this much. I don't like them pointing straight up. I kind of angle them in. And then what I'll do is I'm going to get one of these skids, now that I have it looking the way I want it, fully assembled with these little set screws, and then from there I will measure this and then make sure the other side matches. Alright, so with these goofy little set screws, you get them on your 1.5 millimeter driver, and then you have to sort of put them in the little socket here on the skid. There's one at the top of each, and drop it in there. So you just push them down, and sometimes, we'll see, this first one is initially going in nice and easy. What I hate about this step is sometimes they don't want to start. It's very hard to feel when you've gone too far. So what I tend to do is I screw it in and then I manipulate the skid, and I can tell if I can slide the skid around, I haven't gone far enough. If it's locked, I can't rotate it, I can't push it forwards and backwards, then I know that I've gotten it just right. But the scary thing to me is it just seems like it's very easy to go too tight and just completely crush the skid pipe and mess it all up. So I find it nerve-wracking because the skids, honestly, they just don't give a lot of resistance here. So this feels good. It's not sliding back and forth. All right, so we got one in here, and then I'm going to measure this distance right here and match it on the other side, and I'm going to measure that with my digital caliper, which is right over here. And again, we don't need to be accurate, like crazy accurate, but I do like to get it close. So we'll go, just going on the eyeball here to into the skid. I went basically 21 millimeters here, so I'm going to line this up here, and I went to the flat stock, not to the curved little end cap in the skid. Okay, so I know that's correct. So without sliding the skid forwards and backwards, I need to eyeball it here and sort of look down the front and match the rake of the skid, the angle that it's towed in towards the center. And this is purely just a visual match. Make sure it looks good to you, and then I usually will double check the measurement of the skid as well. Make sure I didn't slide it. It's like I did just a little. There we go. Yeah, now we're back in business. Alright, so now hopefully we haven't knocked off our two tiny little set screws off the bench while we were manipulating all of that. And we'll go ahead and get these last two in. Alright, and with that, we now have our skids installed and everything looking good. You can see the forward rake here. Again, this is the front of the helicopter of the skids, and sitting nice and flat and level. Alright, so now we get to work on kind of a unique part of the Nimbus, which is the bearing blocks that also hold the servos, and this will all make sense when we take a look at it in just a minute. So I'm going to go ahead and get all that parts laid out, and we'll come back. Alright, last step for this episode is to get our servo main bearing block, that'll the main shaft will travel through assembly all built. So I've gone ahead and gotten all of the pieces and parts and screws, laid out and cleaned and ready to go. So with that, let's go ahead and look into the manual here briefly. So a few key steps. Number one, all this comes pre-assembled, so you have to take everything apart. You should remove the two bearings from the shaft. That's this guy here and here. And then remove all of these screws, remove all the servo screws. Basically take the whole thing apart, get all the screws clean, and then we're going to sort of very methodically screw this back together. So the first thing we're going to do is put these bolts that go through the servo frames in. Now if you look over here on the right hand side, it's extremely important that these yellow surfaces where the servos will go are parallel, and that they're perpendicular to the flat surfaces on the triangular block underneath. And obviously there's, the screws are only going to thread in certain places, so that's pretty easy to get done. We're going to start with that, and then we're going to take some green Loctite, some retaining compound, and get it on these bearings and get those inserted in the main shaft. And then lastly, we're going to go ahead and get these bolts from underneath into that whole assembly such that it's all held together and ready to receive the servos. So with that, let's go ahead and start methodically working our way through this one bit at a time. So this is the main, what are we going to call this piece here? It's what holds our main shaft as well as our servos. So you can see, especially when you take these pieces off, where the screw holes are for the bolts. So, and then you can do kind of a quick double check here that, I do in fact have the surface parallel. It will be in fact perpendicular to the triangular side. And let's go ahead and take those bolts first and get those in some Loctite. And we'll go through the I'm probably going to do my same little rodeo here where I get these started and then make sure everything's lining up before I go too far. Once you get one of these lined up, it should be pretty straightforward though. There we go. It's just got a long distance to travel. Again, I'm just going to leave that loose for now until we get all these bolts in. So we've got that side done. We'll get another one on the frame underneath it going. And these do slide around. Like I said, it'll get a lot easier once we get one bolt in each. But I want to make sure these are parallel. So this alignment looks good as soon as I can get this screw to bite. There it goes. Okay, so now you can see we've got our, these two faces are parallel with each other and they are perpendicular to this face if you look. Got my driver parallel with that face. Alright, so with that, we're going to go ahead and get the other two screws in each of these, let's call them servo rails. Then we'll work on adding our bearings in next. And once you have all three screws in each of these, you can go ahead and tighten them down. Okay, that's one side. I'll finish up the bottom bracket and then I'll be right back. Okay, so the next thing to do is to take these bearings and drop them into the cup here with a little bit of green Loctite inserted on the edges of the cup. Don't need a lot here. Now, these are bearings that definitely have potential to fail in the event of a crash, so don't go crazy with the green Loctite here. You just need a little bit. And you will have to use some heat probably to get these out in the event of a crash. But let's go ahead and get a little bit of green Loctite. Again, I'm just going to use the awl here and just spread a really small amount all the way around in here. Does not take a lot, because it is quite a tight fit. Alright, so with that, we'll go ahead and just press this bearing into place. Just got to get it started a little straighter. There it goes. And then, chink, it just pops right in. Alright. And then let's do this on the same on the other side. Just a little bit of green here. There we go. Same thing here. We're just going to push this bearing in. And that one went in much easier. And then we are good there. So we're spinning nice and freely. So, last but not least in the step before we start adding servos is to bolt this assembly into this lower piece here. And the nice thing is that this block basically has the servo layout printed on it. You can see it there. So is that high strength bearing retainer is mentioned for in here. So we're going to put a little bit in here as well. But we want these two to bond very well to each other, so such that this is extremely stable. Okay. So with that, let's go ahead and get this lined up again. And slide it in. Get it perfectly lined up with our little servo outline here. And you can sight through it, and then we're going to get these three larger bolts. Okay, and then coming up from underneath with these. Again, we're going to just get them each started, and then we'll come back and snug them all up once they're all aligned. Alright, and then this is our third one, so we're going to go ahead and drive this one all the way home now that we have the other two 95% of the way there. With these nice and tight, because we don't want anything vibrating or shaking around here. All right, with that, we've got our now upper main bearing block permanently, well, not permanently, but attached to our plate here that will merge into our frame assembly. We're going to go ahead in the next episode and get all our servos mounted, and then this piece will fit into our frame that we've gotten so far, and then we'll continue from there. So that's it for this episode. We'll talk about servo mounting, centering our servo arms, and all that in the next episode. With that, I'm Nick Wisdom, and this is Hack TV. Thanks for watching.